So yeah, hello everyone. It's a pity we can't do this in person, but as Rod said, this seems to be the way that we're going to have to go for probably at least the next few months. So please feel free to type your questions as I go along. I don't mind. I'll try and answer them where they're relevant in the presentation rather than waiting all to the end. I want to make this as interactive as possible. So as Rod said, yeah, we're going to focus on trace elements and particularly why they're important between scanning and lambing to give us healthy ewes, healthy lambs. But if you've got any questions that relate to trace elements in general, trace elements in sheep, even trace elements in cattle, please feel free to ask. We don't want to just talk at you for the next hour. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So, between scanning and lambing, nutrition, as you all will know, is absolutely vital for a healthy ewe and healthy lamb at lambing time. But to get all that nutrition together, one of the key parts of that is that the animal has adequate trace elements. So those trace elements play a crucial role when we're talking about nutrition. They allow animals to extract energy from the ration. They allow animals to build a healthy immune system. They are crucial to making sure that at lambing we get healthy lambs. So what is a trace element? It's a dietary element that is needed in very minute quantities, hence the phrasing of trace, for the proper growth, development and physiology of the organism. Now, the ones that we're going to focus on tonight are the ones that we would most commonly find in shortfall in UK livestock. So that's going to be copper, iodine, selenium and cobalt. Now, they're not the only trace elements that are important for the health and productivity of sheep and cattle, but they are the ones that we commonly see as a problem in the UK. So why are these trace elements so important between scanning and lambing? So as the ewe goes through late pregnancy, there's obviously a lot of changes that are undergoing in terms of her physiology. One of those big changes that is happening is that the lamb is starting to take up more and more room inside the ewe, and therefore that starts to take up space where her rumen would be. That can mean that we can get changes in dry matter intake, which tends to drop because that rumen space has become smaller. If we get changes in dry matter intake, we will also get changes in the trace elements that the animal has got available to it. So where an animal naturally gets trace elements from is from its diet. So if we reduce the amount of food available to the animal, we're also reducing her trace element intake. Now, these trace elements are important at this stage of late pregnancy because not only are they required by the ewe, but they're also required by the lamb. So during pregnancy, what happens is the trace elements that the ewe is ingesting are processed in her body, go into her bloodstream, and then they are passed on to the lamb via the placenta. And that's really crucial because what we need is we need lambs at birth that have got a store of these trace elements so that they can be functioning, healthy, vigorous lambs at birth. So we need enough trace elements for the ewe in late pregnancy in order for her to pass them on to the lamb so that it can be born with it. So trace elements are needed for the lamb. They're also needed for the ewe. So during late pregnancy and into early lactation, we've got a lot of productive resources that we're asking the ewe to produce. So we're going to ask her to lactate through and give some energy and protein to that lamb. What we need is for her to be as healthy as possible in that stage to allow her to be as productive as possible so that we can grow that lamb as fast as possible. And all that relates back to her being of optimum trace element status. So I'm going to show you for those trace elements that I talked about as being so commonly in shortfall in the UK, I'm going to show you why those 4 are particularly important. So I'm going to start with my favourite trace element. Yeah, I will laugh at that. which is copper. So I say it's my favourite trace element. I have two, copper and iodine. So the critical thing when we're talking about copper and sheep is I'm going to talk about why it's important, but it's also important, and I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this on packaging and talking to SQPs and things, that copper should only be used in sheep when it's required. And that is because there are some breeds that are sensitive to copper, and giving them too much copper can cause copper toxicity. But it's absolutely vital if it's required for the developing lamb. If we don't provide copper during pregnancy for the ewe, we will see lambs being born with swayback because the ewe didn't have enough copper during pregnancy. It's also really important for growth. It's important for fertility. So if we require it, copper is involved in over 300 enzymes in the body. So if we don't get that balance right, there's a lot of processes we're upsetting by not providing enough copper. And copper is passed from the ewe to the lamb via that maternal transfer that I talked about, so that the lamb is born with its own copper stores. That means at birth, when that lamb is born, it starts to mobilize copper from its liver, and it also gets it in the milk, creates enzymes out of that, and these enzymes, these over 300 enzymes, are important for that lamb to start growing. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what we want, isn't it? A lamb that grows as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. And it will not be able to do that if it doesn't have enough copper in its body. The requirements for copper are really variable, and they depend on what we call antagonists in the diet. So these are primarily, we're talking sulfur, molybdenum and iron. So it's really important when we're considering whether our stock should be supplemented with copper, that we also consider what are levels of sulfur, molybdenum and iron that are going into that diet. And that actually might give us a good indication of whether those stock would benefit from some copper supplementation. So moving on to iodine. Iodine is probably one of the most important trace elements when we're talking about this scanning to lambing period. So we're talking about a period where a ewe may be under some metabolic stress. The temperatures have dropped, she's not got as much feed intake because the space in her rumen is starting to decrease. All that sort of thing can put a metabolic stress on the ewe and make iodine even more important than it already is. So what iodine does is it's ingested by the animal, taken into the bloodstream, and then moved to the thyroid. In the thyroid, it becomes part of what we call thyroid hormones, and these thyroid hormones are really important for controlling metabolic rate. So the metabolic rate of an animal affects how efficiently it can use feed, how efficiently we can get it to grow. So when we're talking about scanning to lambing, we want a lamb at birth to start growing straight away. Therefore, the iodine provision during pregnancy and once the lamb is born is really important to kickstart those metabolic processes. So iodine, because of its involvement in metabolism, is also really important for getting lambs off the floor. So this is really important, especially if we're talking about, say, lambing outside when we're not able to assist the sheep as much as maybe in some of the indoor systems. What we want to see is lambs being born and immediately getting up and looking to suck. And iodine is really important for that. It's really important between that scanning and lambing period that the ewe has enough iodine to pass it on to the lamb during pregnancy, so that the lamb has enough vigor to get up and get sucking as soon as it's born. So there's a couple of things about iodine that affect whether or not we need to supplement it. One is that it's affected by goitrogens, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. One is that it is affected by cold weather. So because of its involvement in metabolic rate, when it gets cold, in order for an animal to stay warm, maintain its body temperature, it will increase its metabolic rate. Because iodine has a role in that, the demand for iodine is then higher in colder weather to enable that animal to increase its metabolic rate and stay warm. So when we see temperatures really dropping, as we have probably in the last sort of week, although it's a little bit warmer today, we do see higher demand for iodine in those animals. So going to talk about goitrogens. This is actually a photo. This is a fresh photo that I actually took yesterday of some sheep that I walked past. I think they're actually growing lambs, but we'll ignore that bit. On my daily exercise, took a picture of these out wintering, and this is certainly where I live, a really common sight. So we've got livestock out wintering on goitrogenic crops, and that's great. The energy and protein that these crops are going to provide is really useful. It's going to grow in this photo. It's going to grow these lambs. Or if we've got ewes out wintering on it, it provides the energy and protein that they require during pregnancy. What it doesn't do so well is provide any iodine, and in fact it has a negative effect on the uptake of iodine. So it's what we call goitrogenic crops, which we find that most brassicas would fall into that category. So if you're out wintering, you're likely to be feeding one of these brassicas, one of these goitrogenic crops. And what happens is goitrogens interfere with the uptake of iodine into the thyroid. So at the start of talking about iodine, I said iodine is really important for its inclusion in thyroid hormones, which drive metabolic rate and enable these sheep to perform. Now, what happens in animals that are fed goitrogenic feeds, fed these brassicas, is we stop this happening. So the iodine goes into the bloodstream, but it's blocked from getting into the thyroid. If we block it from getting into the thyroid, we start to have effects on the animal's metabolic rate. If we start to have effects on that animal's metabolic rate, we start to have sheep that don't perform. So if we're feeding these crops, which, as I said before, they are great in terms of energy profiles, they are great in terms of proteins, they're a really low cost way of keeping sheep through the winter, but we need to supplement with iodine. If we don't, we could potentially see negative effects of that lack of iodine when we come to lambing. So we could see lambs that are slow to get up. We could see lambs that going through their first few weeks are slow to start growing and that sort of thing. So if you are out wintering your sheep on goitrogens or on brassicas, I would definitely recommend that you consider some sort of iodine supplementation. Is there any questions up to now? I don't know if I can see them.
No, I haven't seen any yet, Annie. One question I had was, we don't routinely use copper in the bolus, so I guess you need a blood test from a vet to make sure that you did need it, especially with Texels and
yeah. So my general thing on copper would be, if you don't think you need it, you probably don't. If you've never had any evidence that you do, because actually in sheep, overdoing it is worse than underdoing it. So unless you've got a reason, so it's not like, say something like iodine, I would say if you're feeding a brassica, you should be supplementing iodine.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas copper, I would say unless the animal's giving you a reason to think you should supplement it with copper, then don't when it comes to sheep. Because we crossbreed, we've got continentals coming onto natives, we've got all the crossing of them, makes it actually quite complicated to work out what their requirement would be, and you will start to see negative consequences if they are lacking copper, which would indicate that something needed to be done. So if you're not seeing that, they probably don't need it.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, I can
got one other question here. Find it.
Yeah, so I would say copper is a definite no-no to this breed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say a lot of the time in sheep, even if we don't talk about the specific ones that we commonly would say no to copper would being Texels, Beltex, that sort of thing. A lot of the sheep breeds do not require that copper. We've got to really knuckle down and say, does this animal need it?
I've got another question here, Annie. When is the optimum time to bolus?
Okay, so depends slightly on what we're trying to achieve. So obviously tonight we're talking a little bit more specifically about bolusing at scanning, but we have also in the past done some things on bolusing pre-tupping. So there's two basically different ways of using the boluses. So if you could use it pre-tupping and just before lambing, or you can use it at scanning. So the reason I give those two options is because the bolus is a 6-month bolus. That's how long it will release its trace elements for. So if we're looking at things like improving fertility, then I would definitely recommend that the bolus is used pre-tupping and then just before lambing. So that would be pre-tupping to give the animal the boost it needs, the selenium, the copper if required, the iodine, the cobalt, to increase the enzymes in its body, to increase sperm counts, things like that, make the animal more fertile. I would then say that coming up to lambing, that bolus is just about to run out. So I would recommend that the animal is given another bolus at that point, perhaps around sort of heptavac P time, to give it the trace elements it needs to get it through the very end of pregnancy and into early lactation. That will give it its immune boost, its sort of availability again of those trace elements to hit those targets. So the other option, if you think I'm lambing these sheep, I certainly don't want to have any more lambs, they're perfectly fertile, that is not an issue at all, is to bolus at scanning or in sort of the week after the scanning man's gone. Now what that does is it hits that period of late pregnancy, early lactation, when the ewe is under significant production pressure. And it gives her those trace elements that are absolutely critical to her performance in that time. And it will take her through late pregnancy into early lactation, providing her with the trace elements, with the enzymes she needs to pass on to her lambs. So yeah, two options really, pre-tupping and pre-lambing or at scanning.
Thanks, Annie. We have another question. Do we need to bolus the tups? I guess the answer must be yes. They do all the work.
Absolutely. That's exactly it, Rod. They're working really hard. You need to bolus your tups in advance of tupping, not the week before. I would say ideally, if you can, do them 6 to 8 weeks before you're putting them in. And that's because one of the trace elements that's part of the bolus is selenium, and selenium has a really strong link with ram fertility. So what we want to happen is we want to make sure that when the ram goes in with your ewes, that ram is of optimum fertility. What I don't want is to go, say, bolus the week before tupping starts, and then we get a bit of a lag, because although selenium is released from the bolus straight away, it's got to go into the bloodstream, it's got to go into the liver, it's got to be converted to enzymes, it's got to then play its role in the body that helps that animal become more fertile. So I would say 6 to 8 weeks before tupping, you should be bolusing your tups, who, as Rod said, are working really hard in that period.
Thanks, Annie. 2 more questions sort of related. One is, how can we be sure that the bolus lasts for 6 months? And the second question is, have you any figures to support the bolus intervals, any trials?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do, and a lot of what I do actually, is research into the boluses and making sure that they are performing in the way that we want them to. So what we use is cannulated or fistulated cows. And we basically, when we create a product, we know what we expect its release profile to be. So I want this bolus to release the same amount of selenium every day for the next 6 months. So during that development, which obviously takes place in the lab, we're constantly testing that. And then to verify it, we will put it into cows and take the bolus out of the cow about once a week for the life of the bolus. And that tells us whether that bolus is releasing its trace elements linearly, which is what we want it to do. That tells us that it's going to last 6 months. So we keep measuring it all the way through its active life until we get 6 months, when we expect that bolus to have completely eroded. And if that's the case, then we know that we've got a product that's working. So that's how we test them. That's how we test the downland boluses, and that would also become a part of our sort of quality work as well, to make sure that that bolus is doing what it should be doing. And yes, so we've got figures to support that. And alongside that, we would also carry out what I would say is sort of a more commercial type trial, where we use genuine farms to go out and measure what are the performance effects that we're getting from this bolus. What are the critical things that a farmer can achieve by using a bolus? And we do that on commercial farms, and it's published in the farming press and that sort of thing when we do those trials. So good, lots of questions.
Great, thanks, Annie.
What's that question? I can't see it.
Is the trial and cattle data adequate to cross species to sheep?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually an interesting question, because you can do it that way round, but not the other way round. So you can use cows for sheep, but it's more difficult to use sheep for cattle. So yes, because what we're doing is we are checking the erosion profile of the bolus. So we're checking in a, let's say, real life animal rather than in our labs, is this bolus eroding at the rate we expect it to? In that rumen environment where we've got microorganisms, where we've got potentially slightly different pHs than we mimic in the lab, are we still seeing that erosion rate the same? So we can use cattle to do that for a sheep bolus. Because, to be honest, cattle are easier to take boluses in and out of. Sheep are a little bit small. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the other two trace elements that are really important between this scanning and lambing time. And the third one is selenium. So selenium is really important at birth for the lamb, because it's vital for growth by improving muscle development. It also has got a really big role in liver function. It's got an antioxidant function. It's all linked with this immune system. So what we want to see happening is the animal being of optimum selenium status and having a strong immune system. So if that ewe is challenged, if that lamb is challenged, as they are going to be at birth, that they can put an immune response together that will help them to fight disease or potentially parasites. So we need the lamb at birth to get up and go with a strong immune system. So we need that scanning to lambing phase for the ewe to have enough selenium that she can pass some on to the lamb during that stage. As we've kind of already covered a little bit in a question, although not necessarily relevant for scanning to lambing, I do always like to mention that selenium is really important for ram fertility. So going back to bolusing tups before they go in with the ewe, really important to improve that fertility. So cobalt. Cobalt is probably the most important trace element when we talk about growing lambs. It's probably the one that we see the most in shortfall in lambs when we see them going through growth checks and that sort of thing. So what happens with cobalt is it's ingested by the animal and converted to vitamin B12 in the rumen. And it's really the vitamin B12 that that animal absolutely requires. That's what it's going to use, because that vitamin B12 helps the animal to use feed and convert it to glucose. And that is why cobalt is so important for growing lambs. So during this scanning to lambing phase, we've got to make sure the ewes got enough cobalt, because she's got a lot of pressure on her to use energy from the ration effectively, and that cobalt's going to help her to do that. And then once the lamb is born and it is getting its own milk, its own feed, it's got to have enough cobalt to ensure that it can use that feed to grow effectively. And when we see lambs having sort of big post-weaning checks and that sort of thing, quite often we can relate that to problems with cobalt metabolism. We've got to make these lambs, the rate that we're expecting them to grow at, they have a significant cobalt demand. And if we don't supply it, we will see them go backwards in terms of growth, because they're not able to extract all the energy out of the diet that they should be able to. So cobalt, really important for growing lambs, but don't forget that it's important for ewes between that scanning and lambing phase, because as her rumen gets compressed, she's got to use her feed more efficiently. She's got to convert to glucose as an energy source, and cobalt is absolutely vital for her to be able to do that. It's also really important for lamb vigor at birth. So coming back to, if we're talking about, say, lambing outside, we've got to get these lambs up and going in order for them to survive. So the key things about these trace elements. So cobalt, really important for lamb vigor at birth and really important for lamb growth. We've really got to have that status optimized in order to see lambs performing. Selenium, also important for growth, particularly relating it to muscle development, and also important for immunity. So if we are exposing lambs at birth to pathogens, to parasites, in order for them to really have that immune response, we've got to have optimum selenium status. And then iodine, really important for metabolic rate, particularly important as we see temperatures dropping. Even more critical if we're outwintering. So if you are outwintering stock, you really need to consider whether they've got enough iodine to perform. And copper can be over-supplemented, but need to consider copper and silage along with the antagonists present. So this is the essential sheep bolus. So it's going to provide cobalt, selenium and iodine. Then we've got the option of whether to include copper, but as I said, I'd be very careful with that. Only use copper if you absolutely definitely know that you need it. So it's a sustained and controlled release intraruminal bolus technology that sits in the rumen using erosion technology and releases over 180 days. So it guarantees that intake of those trace elements for the period, whether we give it just post-scanning or whether we go for a pre-tipping, pre-lambing effect. I think there's one more question and then I'll go over to Yai.
Yes, it's how soon after bolusing do they start to benefit my sheep in providing the trace elements? I guess it's straight away, isn't it, Annie?
It's straight away. So that is the real advantage of this sort of technology, this eroding bolus technology. We're not having to wait any period of time between supplementing and starting to get a positive effect, because as soon as that bolus goes into the rumen, into the reticulum of the animal, it starts to supply this daily supply of trace elements, starts to immediately increase the trace element status of those animals so that we get an effect straight away. Cool.
Great, thank you, Annie. Another question: is there any requirement for additional supplementation?
No, not of the trace elements that are present in the bolus. So the boluses are specifically formulated to, that's why we have different weight requirements, so 40 kilograms on the sheep, 25 kilograms on the lamb, because they are formulated to meet the demands of those animals. So you wouldn't need to have any other supplementation.
Great. Okay, thank you. So is it over to you now, Ian?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for turning up. Yes, it is apparently over to myself. Again, yeah, I'm Ian Davis, and I work for the manufacturer of the Downland bolus through Wales and the Border Counties. And this evening, I'm filling in to start off with. We tried to get a scanner to come on board and give us some tips and wisdom, but clearly it's busy time for them. So what I've done is I collated a few tips from people, from scanners all over, really. In the picture there, you'll see John and Russell Davis from Prestine. They've scanned sheep all over the world, really. There are millions between them over 40 years, just enjoying a pre-Christmas drink. So what I've been getting from scanners basically when talking to them, and bearing in mind that these guys see thousands of sheep in the season. They go to hundreds of farms. They see different situations, different pluses, different negatives. And yeah, they have a wealth of information. So when you see a scanner, when he's not too busy, pick his brains. It's vital information, and knowledge is power. The first thing that I got from the scanners was, please, if you're on this, when you're on this webinar, could you please tell the customers, the farmers, to get the sheep in at least 2 hours pre-scanning, because full bellies affect accuracy. And also be punctual. The scanners have a tight schedule to keep, so don't hold them up. So that was a big one. They do like to have the sheep indoors or on concrete or whatever, off pasture, for at least 2 or 3 hours beforehand, so that the rumen well, empties and the sheep in. Interestingly, another thing that somebody said, when a scanner said, was ewe condition at weaning. You wouldn't think it would be that far back, but ewe condition at weaning will affect scanning numbers. And condition scoring from weaning up to tupping is absolutely critical. I'm sure a lot of people will do condition scoring. The optimum, they tell us now, is 3, condition score of 3. So if you have ewes at 3, then they should be maintained on that. If you have ewes at 4, 4.5, they need to be thinned down. And if you have ewes at 2, they need to be brought up. So really, if you can aim for a condition score of 3 at point of tupping, that's great. And of course, the tup, then he needs to be, as they say, full of his coat, really. Yeah. So that's very important, the ewes condition. Supplementing it with trace elements. It's actually John and Russell told me this, but they bear it up. Is the lambs need to be born kicking, so that they saying the kick and hit the ground noisy, get up and suck, bleating. It's very important to get the lambs up off the ground, especially if they're outdoors, because 70% of the body heat is lost through the ground and only about 30% through the air, apparently. So get them up. Selenium and iodine, very, very important for that. So good levels of selenium and iodine. Once they're scanned, once they're born, get them up. Timing the scanning. Scanner from down Cardigan just said to me 80 to 85 days post-tupping is optimal, most accurate. If you want the most accurate scanning, they like to have them about that time. And of course, ewes then in good condition at scanning. They have to be in good condition because that is absolutely vital for fetus development. So in line with the theme of the meeting, I suppose, if you count the tupping is kick-off for the match and scanning is half time, then lambing is basically the final whistle. You've got to keep all through the match, and anything afterwards, as they say, is another fixture. Bolusing post-scanning. That is essential for keeping the trace element levels up. As you can imagine, we're having weather of all sorts, all descriptions. They can be in different fields, different quality of fodder, rain, water, silage. Some bales are better than others. So you will have an up and down effect, trace element levels within the sheep. Bolusing will iron that out. It'll keep the levels up into the normal range of all the trace element bloods. And that's what you're looking to do. Also, of course, bolusing. If you're bolusing post-scanning, that'll take the ewe and the lambs all the way through to weaning, which is very helpful. Interesting again, 2 or 3 of them said to me that blood tests in the autumn, and this is correct, of course, and it was interesting to see that they brought it up. They found it from their travels around farms. Blood testing in the autumn won't tell you what your trace elements levels are like in the winter. So yes, by all means, get your sheep cows, whatever, blood tested. But don't forget that's only a snapshot of what's happening there and then. It's no reflection on what's going to happen in a month's time, 2 months' time, especially maybe from now on. They're more or less on silage, not a lot of grass about now. And of course, the lambs are growing. So their requirements are going to get more and more towards lambing. So your bloods in the autumn are only telling you what happened in the autumn. Yeah, so that was really what I gleaned from the various owners that I've been in contact with. So I think now is a good time to just stop and ask you guys, how many questions? You got any questions? Anything else you want to bring up before we move on to the how much? Well, if you think of something, then, you know, just type it in. So, okay, what are we talking money-wise? What are we talking, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are we talking about? So how much would a bolus cost for you for a day? So let's have a think. And then what is it? It's cobalt, selenium, and iodine. And it's covering the ewe and her lambs. So with three lives there, how much would you expect that to cost you in a day?
Oh, just hang on. Yeah, I think someone's got their hand up.
All right, go for it.
I don't know if Tom needs to unmute them, possibly. If Tom's there.
Yeah. Martin, it might help if you type your question, please, into the speech bubble. I'm not sure if we can get you on to talk on this one. Right. How do boluses compare in cost to lick buckets?
Yeah, right. So compared to lick buckets, of course, what you're getting with a lick bucket, you're getting protein, you're getting energy and other trace elements also. So really, I mean, it's not comparable really. But if we go through this slide, we'll be able to tell you how much a bolus would cost you, and then maybe you could do your own maths as how much you're buying a lick bucket for. Great thing, lick buckets are great. However, the uptake can be variable because some animals will lick more than others. And it tends to be the shyer feeders that don't get so much. Whereas with a bolus, in it goes and every single ewe has had it. So how much would a bolus cost for a ewe per day? Would you say 4 pence a day would be reasonable considering all the work it's doing? Go on in. Cost per ewe is about half a penny a day, around there. So really, it's half a penny a day for 3. That adds up to about 3.5 pence a week. So 3.5 pence a week, 90 pence, roundabout approximately for one bolus that lasts for the 6 months. £3.50 for 100 ewes per week, and that includes a lamb's mind. So if you're scanning at 190, then how many lambs? That'd be nearly what 290 animals for £3.50, or a pint of beer. The last time we went to a pub, which is a very long time ago, I think that's what we were paying. Next time, 30 quid for 1,000 ewes per week. So again, 2,900 animals for 30 quid. Or the cost of family takeaway. So really, in the scheme of things, in the scheme of cost versus benefit, it's a very, very good ratio. Lamb and bolus again, just over 3 pence a week too. Don't forget that a lot of people will try and fatten lambs on brassicas, fodder beets, double turnips, kale rape, you name it. Again, yeah, just over 3 pence a week as well. So that's very, that's very, very cost effective. And they only need to have it once. The bolus does the work for you. And I think the message we're putting over is that in a world where we're running faster to stand still or try and make a living, where there's less time, it's nice to have a product that is working for you day and night while you're going to do something different. So there we go. Thank you for listening. Any questions? I saw that question. So I've never bolused before. How easy is it to do? It's it's easy to do. It's very easy to do. I think it's a case of, if you've never done it before, then you should have a go. I know we're all the same. Oh, I haven't done it before, so there's a little bit of reticence as to starting. It is easy to do. It's a very, very good idea. There was another question.
Another question here, Ian. I bolus pre-tupping, then feed downland blocks from 2 weeks to pre-lambing. Do I need to bolus pre-lambing, or am I covered? This is wintering Welsh ewes on turnips.
Right. So start again, Rod.
I bolus pre-tupping, then feed downland blocks from 2 weeks pre-lambing. Do I need to bolus pre-lambing, or am I covered? And these are wintering Welsh ewes on turnips.
Right. So bearing in mind, if you bolus pre-tupping, then that bolus is coming to an end towards the end. Pre-lambing. It should be about finished at about lambing time. You're putting buckets out there for them to supplement them. What happens then from lambing time, straight after lambing, what happens? Are you leaving the buckets out, or do you just stop using the buckets? And also don't forget, that is when, straight after lambing, is when the ewe is in her massive milk production mode. So she needs an extra lot. Also, are you keeping the ewes on brassicas, stubble turnips all the way through, or are you taking them off maybe a month before lambing? That's a question I can ask you. That's another question. Would you need to bolus again? I would say that would be up to you. It wouldn't be a bad move. It all depends on what supplementation suits you. It'd certainly be good to bolus at lambing if you want to take the ewe and the lambs through from lambing to weaning, because again, the ewe is in massive milk production. You want the trace elements to go through from the ewe through the milk to the lambs, and for the lambs to grow and the lambs to be healthy. Don't forget, supplementing with selenium boosts the immune system massively. So any vaccinating you may be doing to the lambs or the ewes a month before lambing, you'll get a much better immune response. They have a strong immune system. That again, selenium will boost that. So if you get a better immune response, you get a better value out of your bottle vaccine. So yeah, it can be.
I'd certainly say that when we do any forage sample in Herefordshire or the Welsh border counties, the selenium, cobalt, and iodine are all very low. So I think using the bolus again is a good idea. The next question we've got, Annie or Jan, is how do boluses compare to drenches?
You want to do that one, Annie, or shall I?
Yeah, I'll go for that one. Okay, so the trace elements that we've kind of discussed today, with the exception of copper, which is stored by the animal, are not stored. So the animal has a daily requirement for cobalt, a daily requirement for iodine, but it doesn't have any mechanism of storing it. So if we give it all the cobalt it requires for a week in a day, it will have adequate for one day and none for the rest of the week, because it's got no method of going, oh, this is the cobalt I need for a week and I'll store it. So the problem with drenches is we get big fluctuations. So when you drench the ewe, the lamb, all that trace element becomes available in the rumen, in the stomach, for absorption. What she can't do is go, this is the only drench I'm going to get this month, so I'll hold on to it. So what she does is she takes in the maximum amount of trace element that she can and excretes the rest. Whereas with a bolus, what we see is we've got this sustained release erosion. We are only supplying the animal on a daily basis with what she requires. So actually there's more trace element available to that animal in that 6-month period. With drenches, they just don't last very long. And although they can be really effective, say finishing lambs, that sort of thing, if we've got lambs going for slaughter, we just want to give them that extra boost of growth, a drench can be really effective. But if we want to sustain the release of those trace elements and really get as much for our money as we possibly can, then a bolus will give you a much better effect.
Okay, thanks, Annie. The next question is, if you bolus pre-lambing, when would the lambs need their first bolus?
Right, so lamb would need the first bolus when it gets to 25 kilos. The reason for that being that they should be getting the trace elements from the milk, and it gets to the 25 kilo weight where you can bolus them on up. If the lambs need supplementing earlier than 25 kilos, then a trace element drench is a good idea. Okay, there's no problem with that. But you need to be giving it every 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah. And back to Martin. Martin asked a question earlier about the using the down blocks, etc. He said blocks to appetite after lambing onto grass and turnips to first lamb. Not Martin, what might be good if you could email me rod@rmjones.com. I can get Jan and Annie to contact you directly about your specific case there. That might be the best to give you a more in-depth answer to that. So it's if you email me at rod@rmjones.com, we can sort this out.
Yeah, just drop Rod your contact details, and either myself or I can give him a ring.
Good. Yeah, thanks. And then question from John: will applying cobalt selenium fertilizer raise the background level high enough not to need bolusing? Or does it give a decent base level in the forage to allow boluses to work more effectively?
Yeah, so when you're adding trace elements to pasture, there are lots of things happening here. Firstly, you have to have your pH just right for them to be available. Secondly, you've got to pray that it doesn't rain too much, because quite often they don't fasten very well. And thirdly, you've got to go to chapel every Sunday to pray that you've got growing weather. That's the big thing. I mean, it may be in the soil, but if it's not growing, then nobody can do anything about that. I mean, we've had plenty of summers that have been wet and not warm enough to grow grass in bulk. So, yeah, I mean, by all means, give it a go. I think it isn't as effective as other methods. And again, you need to see the data. But the thing is, I mean, also, if you've got a lot of grass and it's been raining, that animal will be taking water in with the grass. So the dry matter, the dry matter level in the rumen isn't what it should be. So they're not taking in as much nutrients as they should. Lots of things. And it's just another tool in the box, really.
Okay. Thanks, Jan. Next question. I've heard the boluses don't work as well in the second year of use. Have you found this in trials?
You going for that, yeah? Or do you want me to go?
Oh, go on in.
Well, I'm going to say, obviously, the obvious answer is no. We have not found that in trials. So, boluses, what they offer is sustained effect. So, what we can sometimes find is if you're on a farm that has a specific trace element problem, and that problem is resolved by a bolus in 1 year, then we can see therefore a performance effect. Because when it comes to trace elements, what we're trying to, and I haven't actually mentioned this word tonight, it's usually my favorite word, is what we're trying to do is optimize trace element status. I'm not trying to take trace element status higher and higher, because that is actually not what we're trying to achieve. An animal has its trace elements requirement, and that requirement is to meet the enzyme demands in its body. And once we've optimized trace element status, what we don't see is any benefit of increasing that trace element status anymore, because in terms of that animal's performance, perhaps we've met its genetic potential, perhaps there's something else in its diet holding it back, perhaps it's subject to parasites, things like that. But increasing that trace element status higher and higher will not improve performance. So perhaps what we're seeing on the farms where they are deemed to not work as well in the second year is actually we've optimized the trace element status of these animals, and they're not being impeded by trace elements anymore. In fact, to raise their performance, we need to tackle something different in the performance of those animals. Does that make sense, what I just said?
Thanks, Andy. James Simcock, you've raised your hand. If you unmute, you can ask a question now.
Oh, we can't hear you, James.
No, James has his hand up. James, if you unmute, you can unmute yourself and we can hear your question. Okay, I guess it's very easy to click the wrong button, so we may probably have to leave it there. Well, Annie and Jan, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating evening. I've learned quite a lot. And there's another question come in. We're doing very well. Could lamb boluses used on really light ewes, 45 kilos, where conventional boluses might be scary to apply? Can lamb boluses be used on really light ewes, so 45 kilos, where conventional boluses might be scary to apply?
Okay, so yes, by all means. I have a lot of customers, especially the ones right up on top of the mountain, farming real tough Welsh ewes who might not get over 40 kilos. There's an awful lot of them starting now to bolus after scanning, and they're giving them lamb boluses. They don't give them lamb boluses pre-tupping, because they want one lamb per ewe right up on the top. They don't want twins. Twins are no good to them. So they give them the lamb bolus in a week or so after scanning, and that gives them 4 months of supplementation while they're up there, take them straight through lambing, straight into the milk production, gets the lamb up off the ground because they're lambing on the hill. If you've got a westerly coming in with blowing a hoolie in, and that is when a lot of lambs tend to be born. You want them up off the ground, shivering and sucking, and that makes a big difference. So yes, you can.
Thanks, Ike. Well, it's been nearly an hour. It's gone so fast. Annie and Jan, thank you very much. Really interesting. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We've had nearly 40 people on. If you've got any questions, please get in contact with us at R M Jones, and we'll pass them on to Jan or Annie, or we'll sort them out ourselves.
There's one just come on now, Rod.
What's that?
Just come on now. There's another question just come on.
Yeah. Some reports state when ewes are culled, boluses are in the ewe's gut.
Yeah.
So when the ewes go, if they're culled early within the lifespan of the bolus, so within that 6-month lifespan, you will be able to extract the bolus back out of the rumen. So I have even heard it under the extreme in New Zealand, where they've bolused animals and then for some reason had to cull it a week or two later and asked for their bolus back, because that's how tight they are out there. Give it to something else. So yeah, if they are culled within the lifespan of the bolus, you should be able to extract them back out the rumen or reticulum.
Good. Okay. Well, on that note, the time's gone very fast. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye, guys.